It was the 1970s. Disco music was on the radio, bell-bottoms and marshmallow shoes were the style, and karate flicks were the main attraction in the Bronx. American pastime? Baseball was for those who could afford it, and for the rest of us was stickball using one's mother's broom or mop as a bat. Most joined gangs to protect their turf while others got into church not to get hurt. Welfare and food stamps were the pride of the household, for unemployment and oppression were the factors. Corruption and the police were all the same, that's why nobody ever bothered to call them street justice. Was the name of the game, featuring corporal punishment. For one group of guys, it was always a day at the zoo. 9 friends, Edward, Francisco, Issy, George, Bond, Chaps, Rock, Roy, and Frank, always stuck together like glue. Daily they would climb the zoo gates, climb trees, run around the outer parts of the zoo, and or play hide-and-seek at daytime. At night hours, they would climb the zoo gates, go bother the animals, and steal birds' eggs to throw at the night watchman, who would always chase them out of the zoo. At times, the group would terrorize the people who visited the zoo by throwing firecrackers and smoke bombs inside dark buildings containing bats and snakes, real pranksters, this group of guys. The funny part about this is that nobody ever got caught. Nor did the police have a clue who the pranksters were, because they one evening, under an old tree in the zoo, the 9 friends took an oath to become blood brothers, friends to the end. They each pricked their thumbs with a needle and stuck them all together. Then they all carved their names on the old tree as a symbol of friendship. They all agreed to meet at this location in 30 years or so for a master plan. With an overseas war going on, nobody really knew the future, so friendship was the only thing to hold on to. For years went by, and the 2 oldest of the group, Chaps and Bond, were drafted into the war. The 7 members left. Edward, Francisco, Issy, George, Rock, Roy, and Frank found them selves unemployed. They were school dropouts with no way out of the ghetto. One evening, Francisco decided to take charge of the group and had them meet in the South Bronx. He discussed the topic of selling drugs and taking numbers to make a living for their heirs and girlfriends. They all agreed in this money-making plan and decided to call themselves the Sevens Gang. They all started by pitch ing drugs to local drug dealers to build up collateral and respect on the streets of the South Bronx. Meanwhile, Chaps and Bond were fighting for respect in the streets of Saigon. Both battles were one and the same, a survival of the fittest, while the Bronx was burning to the ground. 10 years went by, and the Sevens Gang ruled part of the South Bronx. One member, Issy, ran the numbers of the Southern Boulevard, paying off corrupt cops and politicians to keep them in place. George and Rock opened up an illegal betting casino on East Tremont with poker machines, crap tables, roulette tables, etc., also with cops on the pad. From the goodness of his heart, Francisco set up a nickel-bag coke operation on East 180th Street for those who couldn't afford coke and had police rookies turning over their shields for the stuff. Edward, Frank, and Roy decided to cook and sell crack, a new wave of drugs. Edward decided to take a course in banking in the day and cook crack at midnight hours to learn how to finance money resources. Meanwhile, the whereabouts of Chaps and Bond were unknown. Rumors were that they went AWOL. The money poured in like a flowing river. Cops began buying lakefront properties in Buffalo, New York, the Catskills, etc. moving their families away from urban minority areas with corrupt monetary benefits. The police played Monopoly with the minorities daily with no get-out-of-jail-free card. All of a sudden, the Bronx cops didn't want to live in New York City anymore. They all started moving. The mob was left to keep order in the streets, street justice again. Rap music was beginning to catch the wave. The money being made was taking up much space in the apartment. Already there were 2 rooms packed ceiling high and wall to wall with 10s, 20s, and $5 bills. It was probably about $2 million or so. Something none of the 7 knew how to handle yet. Francisco was in charge and knew he couldn't go to the bank with the cash, so he decided to buy many cars at an auction and make them New York livery cabs. They all agreed to also rent a garage to service the motor vehicles. Soon the cash flow began to circulate there by exchanging the old bills for new ones, laundering the money using legitimate businesses. Francisco talked the gang into opening up a supermarket on East Tremont to supersize the laundering operations. Bodegas were already being taken over by other ethnic groups, so the gang didn't bother with old times. Instead, the gang began to invest in land. They began to buy land in Puerto Rico, a commonwealth of the United States. They knew the IRS wouldn't come looking for anything there. They also began getting mega land in the Dominican Republic for future withdrawal of liquid cash assess. It was now 1985, and rap was at full swing with the move. Meant everything that happened in the streets was rapped on the radio, shooting everywhere, drive-by shootings, all-out street wars. Drugs were in demand, especially crack. Edward was now working as a banker and helped with laundering the finances. They dropped the gang name to avoid turf wars. Finally, after all these years, Bond showed up alive and well. He claimed that Chaps was missing in action and that he was taken as a prisoner of war. Bond seemed to have been missing in action himself. He was broke and had no food or family. He reminded the guys of the friendship oath taken in blood at the zoo and cried. Francisco, Edward, Issy, George, Roy always got away. They knew the zoo like the back of their hands. Rock and Frank circled around Bond and hugged him and said, "Now we are the 8 Balls Club," being they never brought kilos of coke, only in 8 balls at a time. This way, the drug enforcement agency wouldn't come after them. "Kilos are for suckers," the gang exclaimed. They immediately took Bond to get cleaned up and live with them. Edward even opened up a bank account in his name. The club now vowed to secrets and dress codes, keep it plain and stupid. Only wear t-shirts, jeans, and sneakers and not too much gold, a standard street guy, not a mobster wearing a $2,000 suit. This would make the FBI notice everything. The number 1 rule of all was, say no to drugs, another secret. It was now 3 years later, 1988. The 8 Ball Club was in full swing. They had drug runners, drug peddlers, bolita number bears runners, Puerto Rican lottery runners, etc., all sorts of workers. Except killers, because thou shalt not kill. Besides, it's bad for Boosie. Ness. Meanwhile, the mob was busy blowing one another's brains out. In Brooklyn, gangster rap lives on until the break of dawn. So they say. At the White House, the president caught wind of the new dawn, the mob killings, cop killing records, etc., and put his foot down. All of a sudden, laws were passed in Capitol Hill to change what was going on in America, and the 8-Ball Club, without a worry in the world, continued their operations. Meanwhile, the FBI went after the Bronx mob for the next 4 years. Business began to boom at East 180th Street. People came from across the George Washington Bridge to buy bundles of drugs. Coke, dope, crack, etc. It was 24 hours of non-stop sales. All you could see were New Jersey plates, Pennsylvania plates, Delaware plates, and even Boston plates, all driving down the South Bronx. They sure didn't come to sightsee or visit the first African American mayor. Many drug dealers had to fly to their native lands and dig holes in their land to hide millions, while the feds battled it out with the mob. The Drug Enforcement Administration took notice and went after the Colombian cartel full force. Drug seizure laws were placed in effect for seizure of all properties, land, homes, cars, boats, money, jewelry, etc., anything that was purchased with drug money. Harsher punishment was doled out for those caught selling or buying drugs. The 8-Ball Club now began to worry and needed to hide their money. Bond learned in the war that the enemies dug tunnels to hide weapons, POW, etc., so he suggested to hide the money nearby. They picked the perfect spot, the old tree at the zoo. Francisco told Bond that they would get together at nightfall with the needed equipment to build a small tunnel in the enclosed wooded area. Francisco took charge of the accounts and told Edward to close out most business accounts for a total of $500,000. They all went and hid the money along with the weapons as suggested by Bond, a real trooper. Bond was back in the day. They cleverly wired a street lamp to supply electrical power to their manhole, or foxhole, as Bond would state it. They vowed to protect the money daily by taking turns going to the zoo as visitors for a change. It was now 1990. The Bronx was in an all-out war for the drug spots. Every drug dealer was shooting other dealers to take over their turf and earnings. No pain, no gain, was the street saying. Best friends shooting best friends for the taking, brothers setting up brothers for the taking, anything goes in this drug war. Many began sticking up drug spots for the illegal money. Besides, they couldn't call the cops. Many began sticking up number spots, and many PLE began to rob their mothers, fathers, sisters, or brothers, all for the hit of crack. Weapons of choice were the 9mm, MAC-10, or AK-47. Just to go to the store was a mission. The Bronx was a complete battleground filled with Army-issued weapons, green boxes and all. Bond figured it was Army guys on crack selling or trading the U.S. government's weapons for drugs. Many said they came from the rednecks down I-95, south of the border. Even hand grenades were available if you needed them. The local police were outgunned in the Bronx. They were no match for what was coming, so they just left everything alone, picked up their share, and went home to upstate New York every night. That was no problem. They didn't live in the inner city. Francisco decided to drop the gang name 8-Ball Club, for the heat was on. They no longer wanted any kind of gang-related name and lay low. They again started storing money in rooms of the apartment. Since the FBI paid a visit to Edward at the bank, many drug lords were either being shot or made men by the FBI. The gang immediately cut out Edward. It was too much of a risk. He was a made man. The FBI finally caught up with Edward's money laundering operations and The business behind it all. There was no escape. The U.S. government seized all the businesses and money, shutting down this entire opera. Tie-in. Edward, as a true friend, took all the blame, pleaded guilty to a lesser charge, and gave the locations of all lands purchased in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic in return for his reduced sentence. The U.S. government seized the lands and placed them up for auction. Edward received 5 years in federal penitentiary on racketeering charges. S.T.O.M.P kept running numbers for income, being that the cops were after drug dealers. Someone tipped off the police on George and Rock's illegal casino on Tremont, and the police trashed the place, making over 24 arrests. Lucky enough, George and Rock slipped out the back door. The investigation brought on the Gaming Commission to investigate other such locations in the Bronx. Francisco's nickel bag operation went down the tubes. The building burned down, and the city seized its property. Meanwhile, the cabs who worked for Francisco stole all the cabs with the title documents and everything and moved to Brooklyn. The shop was empty. Being the cars were purchased with drug money, Francisco couldn't report them stolen. Slick move on part of the cab drivers. Afterward, the shop was raided by police on a drug sales tip. Police found N.Y.P.D, and Francisco immediately closed the shop. All the gang had left was the crack spot with Frank and Roy running the show and S.E. running numbers. The guys knew the end was coming because the law was changing and people vowed to take back the streets. It was the year 1992. A man who played the saxophone was the president, and America took notice of this great man. The drug dealers laughed at the idea of this man stopping crime in America. It was no joke. This was the man who gave back the streets to the POPLE. We the people, that is. Gun laws changed, and this brought the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, ATF, U.S. government agency into the Bronx to bust the drug dealers. The Drug Enforcement Agency worked side by side with the ATF and wiped out the South Bronx. Frank and Roy were busted for smoking the product they vowed not to use along with guns. The money needed to bail them out had to come out of the hidden funds at the secret zoo. Location: Francisco, Bond, George, S.E., and Rock had to come up with $200,000 because of the amount of guns found at the crack spot. They all agreed to bail the Blood Brothers out and went to the zoo hideout to get the money. The boys group, who were now men, had to face the music. At the hearing, Frank and Roy were sentenced to 5 years on probation, and the U.S. government seized the $200,000 bail as undeclared tax dole. Lars, a real bombshell. The criminals in the Bronx began to feel the pressure placed on them by a U.S. president as well as a new mayor in New York City. There was nowhere to run or nowhere to hide. S.E. kept running numbers on Southern Boulevard to keep the funds at the zoo safe. Some of the guys had girlfriends and began getting soft. They didn't want to sell crack anymore. Edward was serving his time like a true friend. Francisco placed junior drug peddlers on the streets to sell dime bags of coke. That failed, the dealers would either get busted or steal the bundles. There was no loyalty in this business anymore. Even the lookouts would be turncoats. The new mayor had creamy nails on the grill. The mob was history, and the blue wall of silence came crashing down. S.E. one day dropped some number sheets on the floor and forgot about them, and along came some cops from Manhattan South on a tip-off to investigate the joint. Cops spotted 357 action on the sheets and arrested Issy with the evidence. What? A dummy. This cost the gang 50,000 big ones. Issy was given 5 years on probation and now took the numbers in the parks. Frank and Roy started up the crack smoking again. Francisco hit the coke with George and Rock. Bond ended up in the Veterans Health Administration Medical Center for Post-Manic Syndrome. At the zoo, Francisco noticed the funds were low and decided to split the money by giving each member $25,000, setting aside Edward's share. They all agreed to take $25,000. Hardly ever came out at daytime and spent most of the day sleeping. Each. Francisco reminded them of the master plan and brotherhood oath taken 10 years ago at the zoo location. Bond stood up, gave a salute, and quoted, "Death before dis. Honor." Everyone stood and agreed with what Bond stated and yelled, "To the brotherhood." Each took their share and headed home. It was now January 1994. 2 years had gone by, and Edward was released from federal prison on good behavior with 1 year pro. Baton hanging over his head. He headed to the Bronx to join up with the Brotherhood once again. By this time, the guys knew the stakes and that the odds were against them. Street-level drug dealing was a thing of the past. Everyone was getting busted left and right. They discovered the U.S. government agencies such as the DEA, F.B.I, and ATF were using satellite tracking methods against the streets of the Bronx. They could observe all street-level action with the use of satellites. They could pinpoint every detail of the streets, drug deal, airs, where they hit the bundles, the money pickups, and every car used by drug dealers. Most of them thought the people were ratting them out or that informants were giving information on their opera tie-ins. Nothing could be further from the truth. Pictures speak louder than words, especially video surveillance using satellite tracking as informants to seal the fate of the so-called street-level drug dealers. This new wave of technology did not only catch the dealers, but now the buyers as well. Now the buyers were taken by surprise by new federal laws set in place without their knowledge. Anyone caught buying the drugs would have their cars, motorcycles, or even bikes seized by the police. Thousands of buyers lost their motor vehicles because of this new federal law. The pressure was on, and the heat was in Washington, D.C. The man who played the saxophone knew the beat and the score of the game. Bond, who had military experience, got the guys together one evening at the zoo to discuss what was going on in the Bronx with this street crime unit and the feds. He explained how certain military task forces operated and how the police were using similar operations with the feds. The guys were surprised on how Bond, a veteran of the United States, knew so much of what was going on. Francisco stood up and declared war on the street crime unit as he snorted some coke. Bond laughed and said, "How are you going to fight Casper the military ghost?" Everyone was puzzled with this statement and said not a word. Bond began to explain, "You cannot fight what you can't see, nor hear yet feel its existence, the ghost being satellite tracking. The new wave in crime fighting, gentlemen." The guys could not believe what they were hearing. They hardly ever watched television with being in the streets all day. Edward agreed with what Bond was saying and suggested a plan to Francisco and the guys. He said, "What if we started a phone operation, selling drugs by phone calls only? They can phone in how many they want and set up a meeting place to get them Inside build. Ings, public parks, etc., somewhere where the police wouldn't notice. Sales of drugs. Francisco said that it might work, and Bond agreed that it was a perfect idea. Francisco told George and Rock to rent a one-bedroom apartment around Bronx Park South to be near the zoo hideout. He told Roy and Frank to go and print up 10,000 business cards with a local phone number that Bond would get from the telephone company that morning. Edward agreed to use his share of the left over money to start their new underground operations, while Essie lay low, still taking numbers at the parks. George went around spreading the news to his buyers to keep the customers in their turf. The printing shop got a little bonus from Roy and Frank, and within 24 hours, the guys began circulating business cards to their private customers only. Within 1 week after installing the phone at the one-bedroom apartment, business began to boom. Someone would call, and Francisco would tell them, "Meet me at the fish store, meet me at the toy store, meet me at the park, etc., never meeting at the same location twice with deliveries made on bicycles only." Francisco manned the phone at the apartment as Bond, George, and Roy cut the coke and dope and made bundles for sales. Edward again resumed managing the finances of the operation, but this time no banks were involved. But at times, money orders would do. Issy stayed in the park, taking numbers as well as serving as a walkie-talkie lookout for nearby cops or unmarked vehicles. Rock, Frank, and Issy stayed in constant communication outside and reported to Francisco inside the apartment. Rock and Frank were the delivery men on dirt bikes. Bond explained the tours of duty for law enforcement watches and demanded no drugs be sold with children around, therefore, restricting sales to being after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The cops' 4 to 12 tour of duty. Everyone agreed to this plan. Meanwhile, the foolish street-level drug dealers and buyers were getting hit hard by the street crime unit daily with the constant arrest of those same people. The more drug spots got shut down, the more business cards Francisco and Bond got printed. The guys weren't making millions, but they sure were cutting the mustard. No police officer could touch the gang, they were untouchable. The new mayor was taking the credit for making the streets safe again for all New Yorkers and promised to do more using the police department as his clutch. The Bronx became a police state with police brutality on the rise. The South Bronx was getting the worst of it, the East Bronx to follow. Guys were taken to City Island, not to eat, but to get beat. Police also had their hideouts for personal street crime unit affairs. No thug was safe anymore. The people took back the streets as land. Lords raised their rents sky high, the price people had to pay to get the streets back. Girlfriends or wives who had their thugs imprees one could no longer pay the higher cost of rent on welfare and were forced to move in with parents or family, sometimes leaving everything behind as they were evicted by the city marshal. Many were forced out of state and out of the Bronx because of no rent control on these buildings once ruled by drug dealers. The people won back the streets, all right, with the mayor getting all the glory. It was now January 1996. 2 years had gone by, and the sax off-on playing president won a second term in office. Don't stop thinking about tomorrow was his slogan. The Bronx couldn't stop thinking about today nor yesterday as the mayor let the Bronx have it by forcing the poor out of the Bronx and making policies for city workers to move into the inner city. On the other hand, the president didn't forget about tomorrow and placed drug lords and drug cartels out policy, brought street-level drug dealers to their knees, drove drug lords underground, and kept drug cartels on check. The mayor immediately wanted to be re-elected to join in on the president's plan. Meanwhile, the Bronx thugs were getting beat up daily by the street crime unit. Some even got killed. After a while, the innocent citizens became thugs to the street's crime unit. Everybody in the Bronx was getting it no matter what the reason was. The Civilian Complaint Review Board couldn't think about tomorrow, for the morrow was being taken care of by N.Y.P.D. As for Francisco, Bond, Roy, Edward, Rock, Frank, Issy, and George, business was smooth as ice. They knew the street crimes unit was looking for those suckers who kept on with street-level dealings, now getting 2 to 4 year sentences mandatory by the state of New York. No more revolve. ing door justice, it now was 1, 2, and 3 strikes of felony. And you're in for life. The guys wanted no part of that. Soon every one started or joined the new wave of drug sales and drug buying. Everything was private and personal. Meanwhile, the mayor claimed victory by winning a second term in office. Hooray for him. This year, the guys vowed to watch the ball drop at Times Square and join the mainstream in their celebration of the new year. The guys wanted to taste and feel what everyone in the crowds enjoyed each year, while most of the Bronx just sat in the fire escape, blowing fire crackers or shooting guns in the air for the thrills of New Year's Eve. So on December 31st, the guys gathered at Times Square to watch the ball drop within the crowd. The final countdown came, and when it hit 1, everyone shouted and screamed, "Happy New Year!" The guys started hugging each other, and people that they didn't even know started hugging them too. The guys felt like they were on top of the world, but they didn't stop thinking about tomorrow because they realized they lived in the ghetto of the Bronx. They sadly left the mainstreamers, knowing the facts, the truth, of who they are, the Bronx. They all ran to catch the number 2 train back home. On the train, Bond told the guys that watching the ball drop would be part of their master plan if they don't make it to the year 2001. Francisco agreed and said, yes. December 31st would be perfect for our master plan at the zoo. On his agenda, passing new gun laws with the 3 strikes and your rest of the guys questioned what the plan would be, and Bond told them not to worry about tomorrow. They all laughed and agreed to whatever plan suited them fine. They got back to the Bronx and wished everyone a happy new year. It was now officially 1998. The gang had everything running smoothly. The drug spots were in ruins. Many people quit drugs and went into rehabilitation programs because of the junk that was being sold on the Bronx streets. It seemed that nobody could get a hold of the real stuff. Street-level punks were cooking up homemade coke, using aspirin and speed and other hallucinogens in their mixture and mixing cancer pills, morphine, downers, and other hallucinogens to make fake heroin in Bronx apartment kitchens. It was a real mess out there for street-level drug dealers. For the fun of drug operation, it was for members only. No one sold to new customers or strangers. A rat couldn't even fit through the cracks. That's how organized the drug lords demanded it to be. The gang would change their phone number BR every 6 months without detection. New cards were printed also to keep business running smoothly. Carrying guns became a fool's nightmare. There was a 1-year mandatory sentence, for starters. If the gun was linked to any bodies, the sky was the limit. When the Toys for Guns program opened, the gang loaded the joint with automatics. No questions asked, right? The mayor suspected drug trafficking in taxi cabs and began pulling street-level drug dealers out of the cabs, livery cabs, any cabs. All the police ever got were kilos of homemade junk. He began pounding the livery cabs, taxi cabs, and yellow cabs using the Taxi and Limousine Commission, TLC. As a result of this knowledge that the street-level drug dealers were transporting drugs via taxi. Now, in the Bronx, people feared taking cabs and instead took the bus or train. Metro cards became a boom. ING business for Mr. I Love New York. The Bronx was now an a lion's den. There was no way out for the drug dealers, just a job, just over broke. Meanwhile, the street crime unit was being dismantled by the public via the media and civil rights groups because of their excess use of force against citizens of the Bronx. People now feared the police and the police brutality in the inner city. By 10 o'clock, every one knew where their children were, upstairs, locked in their rooms. Drug sales were down, and no one was in the corners drinking brew anymore, for this was a crime now. Loitering was prohibited by the N.Y.P.D. of the Bronx. Got caught with a beer in your hand, a fine, or rest peacefully in the ghetto without loitering or going outside their buildings, for now this also became a crime. To keep the fire going, the mayor put more cops on the beat. You couldn't make a move without a cop breathing down your neck. It was a direct passageway to Rikers Island. The fun of drug operation was kept for members. Only for the years that lay ahead. The gang changed departments often to avoid detection by police. Customers were now screened to sniff out the rats. The gang was not making mega bucks, but they made enough not to end up back on welfare, which now became workfare, in which the person had to clean up the city's mess for their checks. Roy and George got their girlfriends pregnant and needed more money to start their families. Edward decided to get married through the Catholic Church because of the beliefs he claimed, but the gang knew it was a shotgun wedding, being that the girl was only 17. The girls wouldn't give Bond the time of day with all the drugs. The Veterans Administration Hospital had him taking 4 Francisco. Rock, Frank, and Issy, life was nothing but a dream, so they stayed single. Besides, it was better to deal with the business without all these emotional conflicts. After all these years, the Brotherhood oath stood tall. It was now November 2000, over 2 years had gone by. The